I woke with my forehead against the steering wheel. For a few seconds, I thought I'd pulled over for a nap. Then I looked through the windshield. I was in the parking lot of Webster Market, a grocery store I almost never used. Afternoon traffic moved beyond the lot. The dashboard clock read 4:03 p.m. My name is Roy Aldwin. I was 66 and I'd spent 40 years driving trucks across the country. Ice heat night runs bad roads. I knew what exhaustion felt like before it became dangerous. In 40 years, I had never fallen asleep behind the wheel. Not once. The keys were in the ignition. I tried to remember putting them there. Nothing. I tried to remember leaving my house. Nothing. The last thing I could place clearly was lunch in my own kitchen. After that, there was a hole. I checked the map. Webster Market was 11 miles from home. 11 miles, and I couldn't remember one turn. My mouth was dry. My head felt heavy, but I knew where I was. I knew the date. I knew the road outside the lot. That made it worse. I looked around the cab. No damage. No bags. No receipt. Then I noticed my knees. They were too close to the dashboard. The driver's seat had been pulled forward several inches. That was wrong. At 6'2", I kept it almost all the way back. Seat position was muscle memory. I pushed it back until my legs settled where they belonged. Maybe I'd moved it. Maybe I'd been confused. That possibility frightened me more than the parking lot. I called my son. Dad, Evan said. I'm at Webster Market. A pause. What are you doing there? I don't know. I heard him say something away from the phone. Then Mara, my daughter-in-law, came on. Roy, stay there. Don't drive. I'm fine. Please. We'll come get you. I almost argued. Then I looked at the store sign again and realized I couldn't explain how I'd gotten beneath it. So I waited. Evan drove me home. Mara followed in my pickup. At the kitchen table, she asked what I remembered. Lux, I said. Then waking up in the truck, her expression tightened. Roy, this isn't the first time. I looked at Evan. He looked down. Mara listed things from the previous weeks, an evening when I'd supposedly asked the same question 3 times, a bill I'd forgotten paying, a conversation with Evan I couldn't remember the next morning. Small things. But stacked together, they sounded different. I've been tired, I said. I know. Mara put her hand over mine. We're not blaming you. 2 days later, she came with me to see Dr. Halpern, my family doctor of 20 years. Mara described the naps, the forgotten conversations, then the parking lot. He drove 11 miles, she said, and didn't remember doing it. Dr. Halpern looked at me. Roy, as far as I know, that's what happened. That was the problem. I couldn't contradict her. Mara leaned forward. This isn't just forgetfulness anymore. Dr. Halpern said he wanted more information. Mara already had a suggestion. A formal cognitive and capacity evaluation. I'd spent a career around commercial driving rules. I understood what it meant when somebody questioned whether a person was still safe to make decisions. This wasn't only about driving. It was about whether other people could start deciding things for me. On the ride home, I kept thinking about one fact. 3 months earlier, none of this had existed. That was when Evan and Mara moved in. Their lease was ending. I had 3 empty bedrooms. Mara said they could help while they got back on their feet. It sounded reasonable. For the first few weeks, I was glad they were there. Mara cooked. Evan fixed things I'd been putting off. Coffee was ready in the morning. Someone remembered appointments before I did. It felt like family, not supervision, and I had no reason to think otherwise. I was not a suspicious man. 40 years on the road had taught me caution, but caution wasn't the same as seeing danger everywhere. Still, after the parking lot, something had changed. Other people were keeping track of what I remembered. Other people were explaining my behavior. Other people were beginning to decide what I should and should not do. And the frightening part was that I couldn't yet prove they were wrong. Before Evan and Mara moved in, my days were boring in a way I had earned. I still woke around 5:30 most mornings. 40 years of freight schedules had trained my body better than any alarm clock ever could. I'd make coffee check the weather, even though I wasn't hauling anything anymore. eat something simple, and decide what needed doing around the house. The place was too big for one person. My wife had died 6 years earlier, and after that I kept telling myself I'd eventually move somewhere smaller. I never did. There was always a reason to wait. Then Evan called and said the lease on their apartment was ending. He and Mara needed a few months to straighten out their finances. I had the room, so they came. At first it was good having them there. Evan replaced the light above the back steps. Mara cleared out a cabinet I'd been meaning to organize for 2 years. She started making dinner most nights, and there was coffee waiting when I came downstairs. "You spent 40 years taking care of everybody else," she told me one morning. "Let somebody take care of you for once." I laughed. I drove freight. I didn't rescue civilization. You know what I mean. And I did. The first strange thing happened about 3 weeks after they moved in. I'd eaten dinner with them and sat down in the living room to watch a baseball game. The next thing I knew, the television was showing the late news. I looked at the clock. Almost 11. I couldn't remember the final innings. That wasn't alarming by itself. People fall asleep watching television every day. I assumed I'd done the same. The next morning, Mara asked whether I remembered what we'd decided about the internet service. "What decision?" She gave me a patient look. "We talked about switching providers last night." I was asleep. "No, you weren't. You were awake." I looked at Evan. He nodded. "You said the price was ridiculous and told Mara to change it." I had no memory of saying that, not even the beginning of one. "Well, I said the price is ridiculous." Evan laughed. That made it easy to laugh, too. A few days later, I found an envelope from the electric company on the counter. "Did this come today?" I asked. Mara looked over from the stove. "You opened it yesterday." "I didn't." "You were standing right there." She pointed toward the end of the counter. "You said you'd already paid it." I checked my bank account. The payment had gone through, so again, there was nothing to argue about. I had apparently done something correctly and forgotten doing it. That bothered me more than simply misplacing an object. With a missing pair of glasses, you could blame distraction. A completed payment was different. There had been steps. Open the bill. Check the amount. Log in. Make the payment. And somehow the entire sequence had disappeared. After that, I started paying attention to myself. Not investigating. Just paying attention. Did I leave doors unlocked? No. Did I forget appointments? Not that I could tell. Did I get lost? Never. I still knew every road around town and could tell you which interstate interchange in 4 states had the worst merge lanes. But every so often, there would be an empty patch in an evening. I would remember dinner. Then maybe sitting down. Then nothing until later. Mara noticed them too. At breakfast, she'd say things like, "You seen Constitutes again last night?" Or, "You asked Evan the same thing twice." Her tone was never cruel. That mattered. If she'd mocked me, I might have pushed back. Instead, she sounded concerned. And concern is harder to argue with. Evan began suggesting that I take things easier. "You don't need to be driving into town every day." "I don't drive into town every day." "You know what I mean." No, I didn't. But I knew he wasn't trying to insult me. At least, that's what I told myself. One afternoon, I decided to drive out to a truck stop about 20 miles away, where I'd known the owner for years. Mara saw me pick up my keys. "Where are you going?" "Coffee." "We have coffee." "The coffee there lies to me less." She smiled, but then asked, "Do you want Evan to drive you?" I stared at her. "For coffee." "I'm just asking." I went alone. Nothing happened. I drove there, sat with 2 old drivers for an hour, drove home, and remembered every mile of it. That should have reassured me. Instead, it confused me. If I were really beginning to lose my memory, why did it seem to happen at such specific times? I didn't have an answer. So I chose the easiest explanation. Fatigue. Retirement had changed my schedule. I wasn't exercising as much. I was eating later because Mara liked dinner around 7. Maybe I wasn't sleeping properly. Maybe age had finally started collecting interest. At my next routine appointment, Dr. Halpern asked whether I'd noticed any changes in concentration or memory. Before I could answer, Mara said, "Mostly in the evenings." I looked at her. She continued, "He gets confused when he's tired." Dr. Halpern turned back to me. Do you think that's accurate? I hated that I couldn't say no. Sometimes, he ran through a few ordinary questions. Date, location, recent events, basic recall. Nothing dramatic happened. I answered everything. Dr. Halpern didn't diagnose anything. He suggested better sleep, regular meals, hydration, and keeping track of whether the episodes became more frequent. That sounded reasonable. On the way home, Mara stopped at a pharmacy and came back with vitamins, electrolyte packets, and a new insulated travel mug. "For your water," she said. "You never drink enough." I used it because she was probably right. For the next couple of weeks, the strange evenings continued. Not every day. That was important. Some days I was completely normal from morning until midnight. Other days, by late afternoon, my thoughts felt slow. I'd sit down for a few minutes and wake an hour later. Once Evan told me we'd spent almost half an hour discussing whether I should sell my old motorcycle. I remembered him bringing it up. I did not remember the conversation after that. What did I say to that you were thinking about it? I am not thinking about it. He frowned. Dad, you said you were. Something about that exchange stayed with me. Not because of the motorcycle. Because I knew myself. I might change my mind about something, but I didn't usually forget having a mind to change. After that, Mara began handling more of the small things. She put appointments on the calendar. She sorted the mail. She reminded me when prescriptions were ready. If I asked where something was, she usually knew. Slowly, without any argument or announcement, she became the person in the house who remembered things. I became the person who asked. I didn't notice how much that had changed until the morning I found my truck keys hanging on a hook beside the kitchen door. I never kept them there. For 40 years, my keys went in the same bowl on the small table near the hallway. I picked them up. Mara, she came in from the laundry room. Did you move these? She glanced at the keys. You did. No, I didn't. You put them there last night. I looked at the hook. I tried to remember. Nothing. She must have seen something in my face because her expression softened. Roy, it's okay. That sentence stayed with me all day. It's okay. Maybe it was. Maybe this was how it started. Not with getting lost on the highway. Not with forgetting your own name. With tiny pieces disappearing while everything else still looked normal. And because the people around you remembered those missing pieces for you, you learned to trust their version. At the time, I still believed the problem was mine. I didn't yet understand why the hours I lost seemed to happen at home far more often than anywhere else. I only knew that my own memory had stopped feeling like evidence. The appointment for the capacity evaluation arrived by email 2 days after I woke up at Webster Market. Mara printed it and left it on the kitchen counter. 3 weeks away. I read the page twice. There were instructions about medication lists, financial information, medical history, and having a family member available to describe recent changes. Mara had already highlighted that last part. That evening, I heard her talking to Evan in the dining room. They weren't whispering. Maybe they thought I was asleep. "We can't keep pretending he's safe," she said. Evan answered too quietly for me to catch everything. Then Mara said, "What if next time he gets on the highway?" I stood in the hallway for a few seconds. 3 months earlier, hearing my daughter-in-law say she was worried about me would have felt like kindness. Now it felt different. Not sinister. Not yet. Just heavier. Because every strange thing that happened seemed to become another fact in somebody else's record of my life. I went upstairs and took an old pocket notebook from a drawer. The cover was black vinyl bent at the corners. For most of my career, I had carried something like it, even after electronic logs became standard. Computers recorded driving hours. I recorded everything computers didn't understand. A loading dock that always ran 30 minutes late. A fuel gauge that dropped faster than normal. A dispatcher who gave one time on the phone and another in writing. You learn something after enough years moving freight. Memory is useful. A record is better. I opened to the first empty page. At the top, I wrote the date. Then 5:42 a.m. Awake. Slept normally. I wasn't trying to catch Mara. I wasn't trying to prove Evan wrong. At that point, I was trying to answer a more embarrassing question. Was I really forgetting as much as they said? So I logged myself. Breakfast. Coffee. Medication. Where I went. When I came home. If I felt tired. If I forgot something, I wrote that down too. The first few days told me almost nothing. Tuesday, normal. Wednesday, tired after lunch. Thursday, perfectly fine. Friday, I fell asleep in the recliner for 40 minutes. That wasn't evidence of anything. 66-year-old men take naps. I nearly stopped. Then, the driver in me took over. One bad reading meant nothing. You looked for a pattern, so I kept going. On Monday, Mara made coffee before I came downstairs. I drank 2 cups. By 3 in the afternoon, I had trouble concentrating on a newspaper article. At 4:30, I sat down. The next clear memory I had was Evan turning on the porch light after 7. I wrote it down. Tuesday morning, I made my own coffee before Mara woke up. No problem. Wednesday, she filled the insulated mug she'd bought me and left it by the door. "You're going into town, right?" she asked. "Hardware store. Take this." You never drink enough. I took it. Around 2, standing in an aisle looking at cabinet hinges. I suddenly felt so tired I leaned against the cart. I went home. I remembered parking. I remembered walking inside. Then there was a blank patch until almost 5. I wrote that down too. Thursday, I had breakfast at the truck stop with 2 men I'd known for years. Coffee from the restaurant. Bottled water from the cooler by the register. I drove nearly 50 miles that day running errands. Nothing happened. By the end of the week, I had 5 pages of times and notes. I sat at my desk and read them, then read them again. The temptation was to see what I wanted to see. Drivers get killed that way. A man hears a vibration and decides it's the road because he doesn't want it to be a tire. So, I looked for other explanations. Maybe caffeine. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I ate too heavily at lunch on the bad days. I added columns. Food. Coffee. Water. Medication. Who prepared what? The last one bothered me as soon as I wrote it. I almost crossed it out. Instead, I left it. For another week, I changed as little as possible. I still ate Mara's dinners. I still took the same medications Dr. Halpern had prescribed. I still followed my ordinary routine. But whenever I could do it without making a point of it, I prepared my own coffee. I filled my own water bottle. The difference wasn't perfect, but it was there. On days I handled my own drinks, I sometimes got tired. I did not lose hours. On 2 days, Mara filled the insulated mug, the heaviness returned. Not immediately. That mattered too. Usually an hour or 2 later. My thoughts would slow first. Then I would want to sit down. Once, looking at the notebook, I realized I had written the same word twice in one sentence. That scared me. But the fear had changed. Before, I'd been afraid my mind was failing. Now I was afraid there might be a pattern I didn't understand. I still wasn't willing to name it. One afternoon, Mara handed me the insulated mug while I was working in the garage. "Tea," she said, "not coffee. You drink too much caffeine." I took it. I drank about half. An hour later, the familiar heaviness arrived. I stopped what I was doing. For the first time, instead of going inside and sitting down, I looked at the mug. There was still liquid in it. I screwed the lid on tightly. Then I put it in the small refrigerator in the garage behind 2 bottles of water. That evening, I wrote 2:10 p.m., tea from Mara. 3:17 p.m., heavy eyes, slow thinking. 3:26 p.m., stopped drinking, sample remaining. I stared at the word sample. That was the first time I'd treated any of it as something that could be tested. The next morning, I searched for a private laboratory in the next county. I didn't call Dr. Halpern. Not yet. I didn't want a theory entered into my medical record before I had a fact. The lab technician asked what I wanted tested. "I don't know," I said. "That's the problem." I explained only that I wanted to know whether the drink contained anything unusual beyond what should normally be in tea. There were limits to what they could screen for. I understood that. I paid cash and left the container. On the drive home, I felt ridiculous. Maybe the result would show nothing. Part of me hoped it would, because if nothing was there, I could go back to worrying about myself. That was frightening, but it was familiar. The alternative meant looking at the people living in my house differently. For the next 4 days, I kept the notebook in my shirt pocket. I wrote down everything. And I waited for the laboratory to tell me whether I had found a pattern or invented one. The laboratory called on a Tuesday morning. I was standing in the garage when my phone rang. The woman on the other end asked me to confirm my name and the sample number. Then she said, "We found a compound that shouldn't normally be present in what you described as tea." I sat down on the workbench. "What kind of compound?" She gave me the name. I didn't recognize it. "What does it do?" "It has sedating effects." For a moment, I said nothing. The garage was quiet, except for the refrigerator humming behind me. I looked at the insulated mug sitting on the shelf where I'd left it after transferring the sample. A sleeping pill. "I'm not making a medical interpretation," she said carefully. "I'm telling you what the analysis detected." That distinction mattered. The lab had found something. It had not told me how it got there. I thanked her and asked for the written report. Then I opened my notebook. I wrote the compound name exactly as she'd said it. Underneath it I wrote, "Not proof of who, not proof of why." That was important, because the first thought that entered my head was Mara. And the first thought wasn't necessarily the right one. I spent the next hour trying to find another explanation. Maybe one of my medications broke down into the same compound. Maybe the mug had been contaminated. Maybe Mara had used a spoon or container that had come into contact with something else. Maybe I'd accidentally taken a medication and forgotten. That last possibility bothered me most, because it brought me right back to the beginning. What if I had caused this myself and couldn't remember doing it? I went upstairs and collected every prescription bottle I had. Blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication, an anti-inflammatory I used occasionally for my knee, nothing else. I put them on the kitchen table and compared the labels with the list in my medical portal. No sedative, no sleep medication. Nothing matching the name on the lab report. Mara walked into the kitchen while the bottles were still spread across the table. "What are you doing?" "Checking my prescriptions. For the evaluation." I looked at her. "Something like that." She picked up one bottle. "You know I can organize these for you. I've managed them this long." She smiled. I know. There was nothing openly wrong with what she said. That was the problem with almost everything Mara said. If I had accused her then, I would have had a contaminated drink and a suspicion. She would have had months of stories about my memory. I put the bottles away. Then I called Dr. Halpern's office. I asked for an appointment without Mara. The receptionist hesitated because Mara had been listed as the family contact for recent visits. "Just me," I said. 2 days later, I sat across from the same doctor who had known me since my 40s. I put the notebook on his desk. Then the laboratory report. Then a printed copy of my medication list. Dr. Halpern read everything before he spoke. "Tell me exactly what you think this means." "I don't know yet." That answer seemed to surprise him. I pointed to the report. "I know what I want it not to mean." He leaned back. "Roy, this result by itself doesn't establish how the substance got into the drink." "I know. And a private sample doesn't tell me what's been happening in your body over time." "I know that too." He looked at the notebook again. "You've been recording the episodes every day." He went through several pages. He noticed the same thing I had. The timing. The drinks. The days without symptoms. But he didn't jump to the conclusion I was afraid to say aloud. Instead, he ordered blood work and a more appropriate toxicology screen. He also checked for other things that could explain confusion or fatigue. Metabolic problems, thyroid issues, vitamin deficiencies. Anything ordinary before we started believing something extraordinary. That was exactly what I wanted. Before I left, he said, "Until we understand this, prepare your own food and drinks when you can." He paused. "And don't drive if you feel even slightly impaired." That last part stung, but I nodded. For the next several days, I changed one thing. I stopped drinking anything I hadn't opened or prepared myself. I bought bottled water in sealed cases. I made coffee in the garage before Mara came downstairs. If she cooked dinner, I ate it, but I poured my own drink. The change was noticeable almost immediately. I still got tired. I was 66, but the strange heaviness didn't arrive. No missing evenings. No waking up with a dry mouth and no idea what I'd done for the last 2 hours. Mara noticed too. You seem better this week. Maybe I'm sleeping better. She looked pleased. That's good. The evaluation will probably help us understand what's going on. Us? I didn't answer. 3 days later, Dr. Halpern called. He asked me to come in. That frightened me more than hearing the result over the phone would have. He had the new laboratory results on his desk when I arrived. Most of the ordinary tests were unremarkable. Then he turned to the toxicology report. The same type of sedating compound had been detected in my system. Not just in the tea, in me. I stared at the page. Could any of my prescriptions explain it? No. Could I be producing it somehow? No. Could the first lab have been wrong? The first test and this one are independent findings. He didn't say what I was thinking, so I did. Then somebody gave it to me. Dr. Halpern chose his words carefully. What I can say medically is that you've been exposed to a substance that isn't on your prescribed medication list. It should have been a relief. For weeks, I'd wondered whether pieces of my mind were disappearing. Now I had evidence that at least some of those missing hours had another explanation. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt sick. Because a failing memory was something that could happen to a man. This required another person. I drove home slowly. For the first time since I started the notebook, I stopped thinking about whether I was problem. I read every page again. The worst episodes. The drinks. The dates. Who had been home. Mara's name appeared again and again. Not because I had been trying to record her. Because she had been the person making the coffee, filling the thermos, bringing me tea. I closed the notebook. I wanted to walk downstairs, put the reports in front of her, and demand an explanation. Then I heard voices from the dining room. Mara and Evan. The door was partly open. The evaluation is next week, Evan said. I know. What if he does fine? There was a pause. Then Mara answered. He can have a good hour and still not be safe to manage everything. Evan said something I couldn't hear. Mara replied, clearer this time. Once the evaluation is done, maybe we can finally make decisions without fighting him on everything. I stood perfectly still. They didn't mention medication. They didn't mention the house. They didn't confess to anything. If I walked into that room, they could explain the sentence 10 different ways. But for the first time, I understood that the evaluation might not simply be about finding out what was wrong with me. Someone was waiting for it to change who got to make decisions. I went back upstairs. I took out my phone, and instead of confronting my son, I called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Daniel Mercer. His office was on the second floor of a building above a dentist and a tax service. That helped. Nothing about the place felt dramatic. I didn't need dramatic. I needed someone who understood what could happen when a family started using words like capacity and best interests around a person who still owned his house, managed his money, and wanted to make his own decisions. Mercer listened without interrupting. I gave him the notebook first, then the private laboratory report, then Dr. Halpern's results. He read longer than I expected. Finally, he asked, "Who currently has access to your accounts?" "No one but me." "Passwords?" "Mine." "Power of attorney?" "I signed one years ago naming Evan if I became unable to act." Mercer looked up. "Durable?" "Yes." "Has it been activated or used?" "Not that I know of." He wrote something down. Then he asked a question I hadn't expected. "What's the strongest incident they're using to argue that you're unsafe?" "The parking lot." "Tell me exactly what happened." I did. Waking in the pickup. 4 in the afternoon. 11 miles from home. No memory of driving. Mercer took notes. When I finished, he asked, "Anything unusual about the vehicle?" That was when I mentioned the seat. He stopped writing. "The seat, it was too far forward." "How far?" "Several inches." "Could you drive it that way?" "I could move the truck." "I wouldn't choose to drive 11 miles that way." "Why are you sure?" I almost laughed. Because I spent 40 years sitting behind wheels. That wasn't pride. It was repetition. Thousands of days. Millions of small adjustments until certain things stopped being decisions. Mirrors. Seat. Steering wheel. Where your foot reached the pedals. Mercer tapped his pen once. Who else drives the pickup? No one, regularly. Has Mara? I've seen her move it in the driveway. Sometimes. He leaned back. Roy, I don't want you deciding what happened from the seat position alone. Neither do I. Good. He turned to another page. But if that incident is being used as evidence against you, we should establish what can actually be established. That was the first time anyone had treated the parking lot as something other than a story about my memory. Mercer asked for the exact date and approximate time. I gave him both from the notebook. He made 2 calls while I was there. One was to an investigator his firm used. The other concerned preservation of any records that might still exist from the shopping center and nearby businesses. He warned me immediately. Video gets overwritten. We may get nothing, I understand. If we get nothing that doesn't prove you drove there or didn't drive there, I understand that too. I had spent too many years with bad equipment to confuse missing information with useful information. Mercer also told me to secure my financial records, not hide money, not move property, just make sure nobody could access things without my knowledge. He had me review the old power of attorney documents. The language mattered more than I remembered. Evan had been named because 20 years earlier he'd been the obvious person to trust. I had signed it when trust was easy. Mercer discussed replacing it and making sure my current instructions were clear. When I left his office, he said, "One more thing." What? Don't confront them. I had expected that. Still hearing it annoyed me. So I just go home. You go home unless you feel physically unsafe and pretend nothing happened. No, you document what happens. He pointed at the notebook in my shirt pocket. You've already been doing the most useful thing. I drove home. Mara was in the kitchen. How was your afternoon? Fine. Where'd you go to? Had some paperwork to handle. She watched me for a second, then nodded. A month earlier, I would have explained. That day, I didn't. Over the next several days, I changed almost nothing on the surface. That was harder than I expected. Mara still asked whether I'd taken my medication. I said yes. She still offered coffee. I told her I'd already made some. Evan still asked whether I was sleeping well. Better. They seemed encouraged. That bothered me until I understood why. The fewer questions I asked, the more they seemed to believe I was accepting their version of events. One evening I walked past the dining room and saw a folder open on the table. My name was printed across the top. Mara closed it when she noticed me. Evaluation paperwork. I nodded. I figured. She studied my face. You're okay with going right there? I said I'd go. Her shoulders relaxed. I remember that clearly. She thought my compliance meant surrender. 3 days before the evaluation, Mercer called. We got something. I drove straight to his office. The investigator was there with him. They had obtained footage that still existed from cameras covering parts of the Webster Market property and an adjacent business. It wasn't a movie. There was no perfect close-up, no audio, no convenient view of every angle. There didn't need to be. Mercer played the first clip. My pickup entered the lot. He paused it. That's your vehicle? Yes. He let it continue. The camera angle caught enough of the windshield when the truck turned. I leaned forward. For several seconds, my brain refused to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it did. Mara was behind the wheel. Mercer didn't say anything. The truck passed out of the camera's useful angle. A second clip from another camera showed it entering the row where I later woke. Then another vehicle appeared. A gray sedan. Evans. It parked 2 rows over. My hands stayed flat on the table. I remember noticing that. I had expected them to shake. They didn't. The investigator advanced the footage. Evan got out of the sedan. He walked toward my pickup. A little later, Mara left the pickup and crossed toward his car. The images weren't close enough to show every movement inside the truck. They didn't need to. There was one fact I could no longer explain away. I had not driven myself into that parking lot. Mara had, and Evan had followed her there. I stared at the frozen frame. For weeks, Mara had told doctors that I drove 11 miles and forgot the entire trip. Evan had sat beside me at the kitchen table and let her say it. That hurt more than the drug report. More than the evaluation, more than waking in that truck. Mara was my daughter-in-law. Evan was my son. I had spent years imagining the things I might one day leave him. The house, tools, savings. Maybe the pickup if he wanted it. I had never imagined needing protection from him before I was dead. Mercer shut off the screen. You all right? Yes. It wasn't completely true, but it was true enough. What happens now? That depends on what you want. I want the evaluation to happen. The investigator looked at me. Mercer understood faster. You want them to make their claims. I want them to say exactly what they've been saying. He nodded slowly. Then we don't show this yet. That was the moment something changed in me. Until then, every move I'd made had been defensive. Record the symptoms. Test the drink. Check my blood. Find out what happened. Now I knew enough. I stopped trying to discover what they were doing. I started deciding what I was going to do about it. Mercer and I spent the next hour building a clean chronology. Dates, symptoms, lab results, medical records, the parking lot footage. We also reviewed my account's ownership documents and the old power of attorney. By the time I left, the important records were secured, and my legal instructions no longer depended on assumptions I'd made 20 years earlier. At home, Mara seemed unusually cheerful. She had prepared another packet for the evaluation. I'm putting everything in order so they have the full picture, she said. The folder was thick. She stepped out of the room to answer her phone. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. A sheet on top was enough. It was a timeline. Several incidents were listed by date. Forgotten conversation. Unusual sleep episode. Confusion about keys. Then, near the top, in bold, drove alone to Webster Market. No memory of trip. I read it twice. 3 weeks earlier, that sentence had terrified me. Now, it did something else. It told me exactly where Mara believed she had won. I walked away from the folder before she came back. The evaluation remained scheduled. Mara believed I was going because she'd finally convinced me I couldn't trust myself. Evan believed I still didn't know what had happened at Webster Market. Neither of them knew that the incident they considered their strongest evidence was now mine. And for the first time since the missing hours began, I wasn't waiting for someone else to explain my life to me. I was choosing when the truth would enter the room. The morning of the evaluation, Mara knocked on my bedroom door at 8. We should leave by 9:15, she said. Traffic can be bad near the medical center. I've got a ride. She hesitated. With who? Daniel Mercer. Her face changed. Only slightly. Your lawyer? Yes. For a medical appointment. He's helping me with some paperwork. That was all I gave her. At 9, Mercer's car stopped outside. Mara watched from the front window as I walked down the driveway. Evan stood behind her. Neither came outside. The evaluation took place in a quiet office on the 3rd floor of a medical building. There were no judges, no courtroom, no dramatic panel waiting to decide my future in 10 minutes. Just an evaluator, a desk, some standardized questions, and a process designed to determine whether I understood my circumstances and could make informed decisions. Mercer had explained that distinction to me beforehand. This isn't about proving you're perfect, he'd said. Good. I wasn't. I forgot names occasionally. I walked into rooms and forgot why I'd gone there. I had done both of those things at 45. The question was whether I could understand choices, consequences, finances, property, medical decisions, and my own situation. For part of the evaluation, I met with the examiner alone. She asked the date, where we were, what medications I took, why I was there. She asked me about my house. I told her when I'd bought it that the mortgage was paid, what the property taxes roughly cost, and why I'd been considering downsizing even before Evan and Mara moved in. She gave me information and asked me to explain it back in my own words. I did. There were memory exercises. Some answers came easily. One took longer. I didn't pretend otherwise. When she asked whether I believed I had experienced memory problems, I said yes. What do you believe caused them? I know at least some occurred while a sedating substance was in my system. She stopped writing. Was that medication prescribed to you? No, that changed the direction of the interview. Not the conclusion, the direction. Later, Mara and Evan were invited in to provide the history they had been giving doctors. Mara brought her folder. I recognized it immediately. She sat with it on her lap. Mercer sat beside me. The evaluator asked Mara when she first became concerned. Mara described the forgotten conversations, the naps, the keys, the evenings I could not remember. Some of those things were true. That's what made her account effective. Then she reached Webster Market. He drove there alone, she said. It's about 11 miles from the house. He woke up in the parking lot and had absolutely no memory of driving. The evaluator looked at me. Mr. Aldwin. Is that how you originally understood the event? Yes, Mara continued. That was when we realized this couldn't be ignored anymore. Evan sat beside her without speaking. The evaluator asked, "How do you know he drove there alone?" A small pause. Because he was alone when we found him. That wasn't the same answer. Mercer noticed it too. He opened his folder. Before that incident is treated as evidence of cognitive impairment, we'd like to provide some information relevant to how Mr. Aldwin arrived there. He didn't begin with a video. That mattered. First came my notebook. Dates and times written before I knew what they would mean. Then the laboratory result from the tea. Then my medication list. Then Dr. Halpern's records and the subsequent testing showing exposure to a sedating compound I had never been prescribed. The evaluator read quietly. Mara interrupted once. There could be another explanation for that. Mercer nodded. There could. That's why we're not asking anyone to reach a conclusion from a single test. Then he showed the pattern in the notebook. The episodes. The drinks. The reduction in symptoms after I began preparing my own beverages. Again, none of it alone proved who had done anything. But it changed what those memory episodes could reasonably be used to prove. Finally, Mercer reached the parking lot. He placed still images from the preserved footage on the table. My pickup entering Webster Market. Mara behind the wheel. Evan's sedan arriving separately. Mara leaving my truck. Evan meeting her. Nobody said anything for several seconds. The evaluator looked at Mara. You said Mr. Aldwin drove himself there. Mara's face had gone pale. I believed he had. Mercer pointed to the timestamp. This is approximately 30 minutes before Mr. Aldwin regained clear awareness in the vehicle. Mara looked at Evan. That was the first time I saw either of them realize that the parking lot was no longer their story to explain. Evan leaned forward. God, we were trying to keep you safe. I looked at him. Then tell her why Mara was driving my truck. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Mara tried. He was tired. He wasn't himself. We moved the truck because... Then why tell the doctor I drove it? Silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. For months, every weakness in my memory had required me to defend myself against somebody else's version of events. Now the dates were on paper. The substance was in a laboratory report. The medical finding was in my doctor's records. And the truck was on camera. The evaluation didn't end with Mara being handcuffed. Life usually doesn't arrange itself that neatly. The examiner made it clear that episodes occurring during unexplained sedative exposure could not simply be treated as evidence of progressive cognitive decline. She also had direct evidence from the evaluation itself that I understood my finances, property, medical situation, and the consequences of my decisions. There was no basis from that assessment to conclude that I lacked the ability to make those decisions for myself. The other questions how the substance reached me, why the parking lot incident had been staged, and whether anyone had committed an offense were matters to be handled separately. Mercer already had the appropriate records preserved. I didn't ask for the details that afternoon. I had something more immediate to do. I went home. Evan and Mara packed over the next few days. There was no screaming confrontation. Evan tried several times to explain that their finances had become worse than he'd admitted. He said Mara had convinced him that selling the house would eventually be necessary anyway. He said they believed I would be better somewhere smaller. Maybe some part of him had believed that. It no longer mattered enough. There is a difference between helping someone make a decision and making sure they lose the right to refuse you. Within a week, Mercer helped me replace old documents and secure access to my accounts. For the first time in months, the kitchen was quiet. I made my own coffee. I slept normally. And then I did something Evan probably never expected. I sold the house. Not immediately. Not under pressure. I interviewed 3 real estate agents. I chose one. I chose the asking price. I rejected the first offer. Accepted the second. The house was more space than I needed. That had been true before any of this started. What had changed was that the decision was mine again. I found a smaller place 20 minutes away. 1 floor. A modest yard. A garage big enough for my tools. The agent sent me the address and asked whether I wanted someone to meet me there. "I'll find it," I said. The morning I went to see the house, I stood beside my pickup for a few seconds with the keys in my hand. The last time I'd sat behind that wheel wondering how I'd traveled 11 miles without knowing it, I had been afraid my own mind could no longer be trusted. I opened the door, got in. The seat was still farther back than most people would have wanted it. Exactly where I liked it. I checked the mirrors, started the engine. Then I entered the address of the house I had chosen. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway. I remembered every turn. And this time, nobody else had decided where I was going.